This session's really about identifying gaps in student understanding of key learning. We cannot underestimate what has happened and how long a time it is. I mean, we often got quite animated about the dangers of students having a couple of weeks off school in term time, and fines were levied and all sorts of other things. This has been way longer, and although some students have massively thrived in this environment, there are all sorts of gaps, and even if they have thrived, it's taking stock of what of importance they've missed and how we're going to handle all that, particularly I mean in year 10 and 12, but other years too. So I'm going to first go to Hilary, as we did in the last session, for some of the thinking and learning from research, and then we'll go to Andy and Tim. So first, Hilary.
So thanks, David. I think the point I'd like to refer back to is what I said in the beginning, is that this is a very, it's unprecedented, and I know that word's being used far too often at the moment, but it is. A lot of the research on the impact of school closures, be that over the summer months or as a result of, in countries around the world where there have been prolonged teacher strikes and children have been out of school for large periods of time, is that gaps in learning and stunting of progress happens as a result of these. But what we don't have any idea about is what does it look like when there's some kind of remote learning or some kind of continuation of learning or attempt to continue learning. So learning has happened while schools have been, I wouldn't say closed, while children have not been in school buildings, learning has happened, but we don't really know how much, at what pace. As David's just said, I think some children have actually thrived. There've been, there's been evidence recently of particular teachers saying their kids are making more progress than they would have done in school. Those might not be, the average, but one of our attendees has put on the Zoom chat earlier, what about those that haven't had access? So we've got a lot of children who don't necessarily have digital access. What's happened with their progress at this time? What's happened with their learning? So the picture will be very different across schools and even within schools. And it will also be different depending on the experience that different pupils have had. And I don't know how many people saw the article on the research the Education Endowment Fund produced last week around the widening of that gap between pupils, that disadvantaged pupils, that attainment gap was going to be wider as a result of these school closures. And what does that mean for return to school? And one of the things it's going to mean is that schools are going to want to be able to go, where are they at? How much progress have they made? What have they learned? What haven't they learned? At an individual level, at a class level, even at a year group level. And I think it'll differ depending on all those factors. Some children will have made good progress. Some children would have made expected progress. They would have covered the topics. They would have learned the topics that might have been taught remotely, while others might need to have those gaps filled. And whole year groups might be, some year groups we've paid more attention to than others as a matter of need. Those year groups might be, might need less gap filling than other year groups. So I think that there's a lot of unknown that needs to be figured out as children come back into school. The example I just keep going back to is that if you have a year 7 maths class, and just before they were sent home, you started teaching ratio and proportion. Now you've moved on to another topic in algebra. Sometime when they go into year 8 in September, you're going to want to know where they are in respect to that topic. And I'm going to hand over to, I believe it's Tim first, to talk about how they're going to approach ascertaining where the gaps might be, or what they've done already to do that.
Tim, okay, so thanks for that. I've just, by the way, been reading the what people have been eating and drinking during the things. The fresh strawberries for breakfast and the homemade flapjack are top of my lust items for it. But I mean, the serious point about this is the human interaction with students and the combination of it with data is something that flows through from that. And I think, and some of the comments on the chat are already moving us into the territory of how we engage with what they know, and that debate of how far students are asked to do stunning pieces of work that really challenge them, and others were just filler activities. And we all know, and I don't think there's probably a teacher in this rather wide room who hasn't done a filler activity at some point, but it is that how we're going to do it. And Tim, I'm going to give, it's not an easy task really, how you're going to cope with knowing what they know and what they don't know and what they've missed. Tim.
And I've not got a very good answer, to be honest, David. I resent the accusation that I would ever have delivered a filler activity in any of my lessons.
No,
yeah,
I know you wouldn't, Tim. I know.
The first half of this was a lot easier to plan for than the second half, because thinking back to the way Andy was talking an hour or so ago about the process of wider reopening or curriculum provision, and the fact that he spent his break reading various updates, there's so much that we don't know that actually what we were planning 2 or 3 weeks ago is less likely to happen. This bit is a bit maybe the stating of the bleeding obvious, but I thought it was worth talking a little bit about the language that we're using as a school to talk about our curriculum provision over the next half term or so, the way we'll use that language in September, and some of the ways that we're assessing and getting some impressions of things at the moment. But if people are listening to me for the next 5 minutes thinking I've got the silver bullet, then they're going to be deeply disappointed, I'm afraid. We're in a position like probably so many of us are now of thinking about our new home learning, like a lot of you will have done. We surveyed parents, students quite heavily last half term and got some fairly robust feedback from ours, particularly, I guess, given, as I said earlier, a little bit of the market in which we are, where, of course, a lot of the engaged parental and student feedback compared our provision with the provision being put on by how should we describe it, places where your education costs a little bit more than it does at our place, and who've needed to react to the business model of seeming to be delivering a high quality education by sticking everything on Zoom. And we don't think that's right, actually, but we are going more live for 12 and 10. We are approaching more asynchronous learning explanation things for year 7 to 9. So a variety of means of looking at video lesson, where possible, including formative feedback opportunities through quiz. And the thing that all of our students were clamoring out for was, they said, richer feedback. It's actually more human contact with that vast number of their teachers who they miss. Our wider opening programme, I put the word in, I don't mean it, because like all of you, we've never shut, is going to, in the end, focus on the greatest need for those in 10 and 12, and then focus on a broader year 10 offer. We talk about 3 provisions, and that's what I wanted to talk through this slide to get to be able to say to you, okay, we talk about now, in terms of curriculum provision 1, provision 2, and provision 3, and this is the language that we'll be using come September, because it's inevitable that we won't be looking anything like we normally look in September time. Provision 1 is what we're very confident that we'll be able to run between now and the end of term for 10s and 12s, which is the unengaged, those unable to access the curriculum. There was a comment earlier in the chat about students' technology access, and try as we might, like so many of you will have done as well, we've not cracked that particular nut. So that our provision 1 is going to be for students who will be in school full time because they've been unable to access our remote curriculum. And that's been based on very intense pastoral relationships and updates with parents led by our pastoral and SEN teams. Our provision 2, which is based on the same type of relationship, so there's kind of one-to-one updates, very, very close, lots of phone calls. Our students for whom we have multiple academic and pastoral concerns, you don't need to be doing much assessing to be able to tell that a child hasn't submitted any work or is struggling to submit any work, to know that they were in a position where we were worried about them in March and February. Therefore, our provision 2 model is to be putting on additional pastoral tutorial, which will then have a kind of focus on working through where these students are behind. In school now, that's going to be a 1 day a week approach. That provision 2 will run alongside broader academic provision next year with whatever form of opening we're at. Provision 3 is our curriculum, whatever we're delivering in school. And of course, that's going to be very tight for the next 5 or 6 weeks, and will be looser and more broad in September. What it looks like in September, how many kids we have in, is a complete mystery to us. But that's the language we'll use about having assessed children. Should they be going into provision 3, which is a continuation of our home learning model, the blended learning approach that will be inevitable next year and time in school, or do we need to put extra stuff in? So our teaching is now looking at greater opportunities for practice. I think that's the correct spelling of practice. I think I mean to use a noun. And plenty of opportunities for recap and explanation there. That's where our teaching and learning is going. Trying to develop that opportunity. I spoke earlier about the regularity of our formative assessment. We're a Firefly school, and that proved quite entertaining at the start of lockdown when it collapsed. But it's been brilliant watching the way that colleagues across the school have learned how to write. The sort of thing I've been trying to encourage them to do for years. Brilliant quality multiple choice quizzes which are genuinely diagnostic. And save a huge amount of time in getting an impression of what's understood and not understood. And seeing that from a distance, and a lot of colleagues, seeing what lessons they've come up with has been brilliant. Various, obviously, subject-specific options, the kind of Dr. Frost approach, and then a lot of teacher judgment on looking at the quality of work that's being submitted. We talk about purple, red, amber, and green, so we prag everything on that basis. Lots of feedback from there. And then I've repeated myself for some reason, but I think that goes to show that just like anybody, Andy might have the answer, so I'll eagerly
looking forward to Andy having the answer. Tim, I think
we're grappling in the dark like so many of you, and we're waiting on Cheshire East to tell us later on today, actually, whether, given the state of the R number in the northwest, whether we're having any form of wider opening next week or not. That's how kind of day to day thinking about our provision is, and so our thinking for September changes day in, day out, really. One would love to be able to give it the time it deserves.
Okay, thank you, Tim. I think the interesting thing is not leaving it to chance and having a plan and a structure, because I think leaving things to chance is probably one of the worst outcomes, because although we'll get some great things happening, it would exacerbate the gaps. Well, there's no small thing to be passed over to you, Andy, in terms of the baton. Have you got the answers?
I can't wait to hear it.
Yeah. No, it's not like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's not that simple.
You've not picked it up on an update this morning, Andy. It's gonna.
Yeah. No, sorry, I don't have the answers. I can only, like you, share where we're up to, and where our thinking is. I think the one thing that's been really interesting to see as we sort of go through the chat is that no system is perfect and foolproof. I've seen outstanding schools with amazing outcomes doing things totally differently. I think lots of people talking about different ways of using baselines, different data sets to use. Like I say, I don't think there's any kind of utopia or perfect system. So I can only share what we're doing and how we have found over time has been effective for us. But equally, you've got to consider your context and what will work with your colleagues in your schools. In terms of sort of normality of assessing gaps, we've obviously talked about the progress tests, and Tim mentioned those in more detail, and those have been really supportive in terms of our curriculum in the past, looking at Year 8 curriculum, looking through into Year 9 as to where there might be particular gaps in knowledge and understanding. Again, tests they only assess the gaps that you cover in the test. That's probably one of our biggest worries at the moment is, when we come back, when do we place those mock assessments? What do they cover that we would traditionally have done in October, November? Do we even do them? They're only going to tell us about what students don't understand on those papers, and are those papers even going to be relevant for what they're going to sit in the summer? No answers, just more questions, unfortunately. We have always used predicted grades. So in terms of our assessment, our ongoing assessment, the 3 times a year, which is now down to 2 times in Year 10, we ask our staff to put in a predicted grade. That's been incredibly helpful this year, obviously, in the process that we've been in, and we know that that's pretty robust compared to when we've looked at that over previous years. So being able to have gone back to that has been a good starting point, but again, it is only ever a starting point. In terms of our offer, so we started off very clearly saying to all staff that we and to parents, managing expectation around an asynchronous approach. So in terms of that, we would provide work online that people could access and could access at a time which was convenient and able to do, because clearly our colleagues are all having very different experiences of lockdown. I think one of the things I've certainly learned through this as a leader is that it's very dangerous to generalize and assume that other people are experiencing the same things you are through this time. I think whatever your circumstances and situation, there are many different ways in which it might be affecting or having an impact. So I think that those conversations are really important. And for us, we have vertical tutoring in all of our schools, so ensuring that there has been regular contact, in a simple way with all of our students, I think has been really important, and with all of our staff. Because I also think the gaps won't necessarily be where we expect. I know obviously the EFF talks about the disadvantage gap, and we've talked a bit about the digital divide, but I also think there'll be gaps where we just don't know, and we won't know until we see those students back in school.
Andy, have you any thoughts about what those gaps are? Have you got any hypotheses that you're beginning to think?
I think when you think about who we might have traditionally classified as disadvantaged, or when we talk about where we know they just haven't got on and done the work because they haven't had it, but I think obviously with the impact on the economy, there will be students and families who will be in really difficult situations that we just aren't aware of. And one of our things we've sort of grappled with is how we can support tutors to have those conversations with parents over the phone that might highlight some of that without putting them in the awkward position of having to ask really invasive questions. So I think, again, and that's kind of the bit about the partial reopening that's a bit of a challenge, is when you have a group of 10 or 15 students in front of you, and what role are you in? Are you in the teaching role or the tutoring role? And how do you maybe identify some of those areas that you would not, those cues you might normally pick up with your tutor group, but perhaps don't always with the teaching group. So it's kind of interesting around how we might identify those things going forward.
And you're asking teachers, it's almost like a new skill set in a way. And there's a right and a wrong way. I mean, it's pleasing in a way that you're saying, encouraging people to have phone conversations and the like. But the way those happen, I mean, I think most of us would say holding up the mirror and just letting people speak is one of the best ways into it. But it is the ways those things happen. I wonder whether we will clearly know I have a thing about the omni-capable teacher, expecting every teacher to do everything. Have you recognised that some teachers are naturally good at some of these new things we're expecting people to do?
Yeah, and that's kind of inherently always been part of our vertical tutoring approach, has been a recognition that you are going to get some staff who absolutely fly with that with very little input, but equally by having some so things like conversation frames and clear structures around when and how stuff should happen, that there's kind of a minimum benchmark that everyone gets. And so I think establishing that minimum benchmark is really important in terms of, I certainly remember starting at Swavesey and coming across vertical tutoring as an assistant principal quite some time ago now, but feeling actually much more comfortable and confident as a tutor, and feeling that I was contributing far more to those students just because there was a structure around it. Our colleagues who are English teachers talk about the ability to teach poetry being, if you provide some framework for the students, they sometimes can access it much more quickly than if you just ask them to write a poem. It's not limiting that creativity, but it was providing a framework within which they can.
And Andy, that's a common theme. I mean, Tim provided a structure, and I think that this range of new skills, and in some ways, the easiest gap to identify is a subject knowledge or understanding gap. You're taking us into wider territory, both in a skills gap of teachers needing a different set of skills. And I think that's quite a powerful notion of how you felt supportive. I mean, the vertical tutoring is indicative, an example. I mean, it's my one regret I didn't do it in my whole career. Well, I've got more than one regret, but a significant regret, Andy, was I didn't do it, because I'm now a great advocate of it. But I think that notion of supporting teacher gaps from the new range of skills, and not just taking it for granted that people know how to do it, but also encouraging people to work in some of these ways, maybe. Is there anything else you want to add, Andy?
I think the only other thing is I think that, again, it's kind of always challenging those assumptions. I know there's been questions in the chat about, assumptions and pigeonholing and that kind of thing. And I think that, again, that for me personally is really, this process has really highlighted that, where perhaps we've had colleagues who we might have thought, oh, we'd be a bit worried about them being able to access or be able to deliver on, and actually they're some of our best practitioners online, having really adapted, and some who you think, oh, actually you might have assumed would cope with it really well, haven't. So I think and that's something we're looking at quite carefully across trust at the moment, is how we provide some optional sort of drop-in sessions for people to be able to share how they've approached it. Because again, like, I'll go back to what I said earlier about people's experiences of lockdown. They are hugely wide and varied, and I think you've got to, we talk about almost like we're all NQTs again, that if you're an NQT and you walk around a school and you go into 5 different classrooms, you'll see 5 different people teaching in different ways, but being equally effective. And I think that's what we're trying to expose and uncover at the moment, is where how staff are identifying those gaps and delivering really effectively, but having their own approach to that. And, whether it be synchronous, asynchronous, whether it be through live sessions, through Teams, using various other tools, but equally managing that in a way that doesn't freak people out, because we all have that moment, don't we, where we see someone who's done a whiz bang thing and then think, crikey, why am I not doing that?
No. Thanks, Andy. I'll stop you there. I do think it's an important point, but I mean, we could evolve a different forms of deployment of teachers, of not having everybody do the same thing too. Just to end this session, we go back to Dan and Darren and how some of the GL tests and processes could aid it. We'll go on to the pupil attitude to self and school in the next session, but in the session after, the last session this morning. But anything you'd like to add on gaps in years along the way, Dan and Darren?
Hi there. Yes, thank you. I think some absolutely fascinating insights there. Thank you, Tim and Andy. And I think just shows quite the challenge of the different gaps that there might be, especially unexpected gaps, which might not have been foreseen at the start of lockdown. I guess where I wanted to focus on just for a couple of minutes now was just around helping identify gaps in learning. We'll clear on how important that is to ensure sort of curriculum and learning is pitched at the correct level for students returning to school. But I think also to help understand to what degree lockdown has impacted lost learning, what knowledge has been retained and what has been lost there as well. With the myriad of challenges facing schools on return to school, we want to really sort of help support schools by providing that sort of clear external insight alongside teacher judgment to help schools identify quickly where gaps are and kind of help triangulate data across core curriculum areas. I think, as has been discussed, and I've seen in some of the comments, I think the focus on learning gaps and trying to understand those might come at different stages through the autumn term, with the focus on pastoral at the start. But I think when needed, the progress test series will really help provide a sort of clear, accurate baseline and help you to understand those key gaps in a cohort learning. Hopefully they'll insights from this will help you with planning on curriculum, but more importantly, just to help understand where that level of attainment is right across core subject areas, to support what you know about those students and what you've seen on returning to school. The progress tests are standardised across 100,000 students and cover maths, science and English. They can either be taken as paper or digital assessments. And they can be used from this autumn term right across all year groups in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. We do go into primary as well, all the way down to Key Stage 1. But really try to enable and support staff on being able to use the data to impact teaching and learning from the start, rather than having to spend lots of time identifying where those gaps in learning are, actually being able to focus that time on teaching, learning and curriculum planning as well. So just want to focus on kind of 5 key things that progress test I think could help support this challenge around knowledge gaps in particular. I think one is just providing a starting point and baseline across English, maths and science. So everyone's got a clear starting point for students on return to school. I think it was a good question raised earlier around kind of what is the what is the fixed standard, what is the new standard of content, and especially after this extended break, sort of understanding where those gaps are and what the starting point for students is going to be crucial. So the data from the progress tests really just gives you a nice starting point to help you understand kind of where those students are when they're coming back into school. I'd say this could be done later in the term, around October, November, I think some people have suggested as well. I think what this is also helping, the group analysis really tries to help you identify individuals that might have scored higher or lower than expected. So trying to help support judgments you already know about your students from the start. We then also provide curriculum analysis at a cohort level. So this will really help support identifying kind of common gaps in learning right across a cohort. So actually you can start to break down the curriculum topic areas and look at particular areas which might have been impacted by students might not have been able to engage with online learning. They might have misunderstood or have a misconception around something they learned while learning remotely. Or actually it will also help highlight hopefully where knowledge has been retained by students as well following the lockdown. So it helped give you a good starting point across curriculum areas to sort of understand right across a class, right across a year group, kind of where those starting points might be. You've then got the more detailed analysis, which is at a question level. So this really helps to just delve in a bit more detail, again, right across a cohort, right across a group, to really look at kind of where potential gaps in knowledge might be. Actually, were there any sort of glaring areas which right across the group students have struggled with? But this will also help to start identifying at an individual student level as well, where potential gaps in knowledge might be. We do provide curriculum maps as well on our website, so you can see how all of the assessments are completely mapped into the curriculum areas. But hopefully this will just start to give you a really sensible starting point on attainment to help identifying kind of these core areas of maths, science and English. And then finally, where you are identifying those students, I think as Andy mentioned, there might be sort of unexpected gaps. There might be students that have gone an unexpected gap than you thought. And I think this provides an individual profile of each student. So actually you can pick out perhaps students where the gap has grown, or actually their learning does look like it's suffered more. Actually, you can start to look in at what does that look like across math, science and English. Where are those gaps at curriculum level and question level? And then you've got clear ideas for teaching and learning to support that as well. And then finally, Darren mentioned it earlier, and I think it's when you put that attainment in context with looking at their potential that it becomes really powerful. And I think especially when students are returning to school, being able to understand what that cognitive profile is compared to their attainment kind of helps you understand how quickly and how much time it might take them to get back up to speed. For instance, you know, if they've got a high verbal score, but perhaps their English score is lower, actually that shows that hopefully they will be able to gain that strides quite quickly in English skills area to get that knowledge back up to speed. Similarly, they might have a low quantitative score compared to their maths attainment. So again, that starts to help you understand that the challenge that student, the support that student might need to help them get back up to that level that they needed. So I think hopefully that just gives you 5 kind of key ways I think the progress tests can help support specifically that sort of gaps in knowledge at the beginning of this term. Just as a recap, they're standardized over 100,000 students. We verify them every year across 500,000 students as well. And this autumn, we're going to be able to look at the analysis of everyone that's taken these progress tests to start looking at what does that data tell us around kind of key trends right across schools in this autumn and this unique circumstances this term, which hopefully then will allow you to be able to measure progress through to next summer 21 as well, to help support you with planning.
Thank you, Dan. That's great. We're well on time as well. What a tremendous team. And we'll go now to the questions and answers. We've been following on chat, and there's a few themes emerged. One of them is that I suppose that whilst the knowledge gap is relatively easy to identify, and tests like this are good, was a comment, I think it was of Jenny, that there is a danger when we get the students back into school, they suddenly have to sit lots of tests. And this raises something that I've always found particularly interesting in a sense. It's the cultural dynamic. I think asking students to do a test if they can't see the purpose of it and the value to them individually, and this takes us into some of the territory Dan talked about, is unfair and unreasonable. So I think and also, as these aren't high stakes tests in the same ways, there are lots of ways of delivering them that aren't quite so formal. I mean, Tim said, you end up, logistically putting everyone into a hall, but they don't have to do it all at the same time in the same way. And there is an opportunity of online as well as paper tests. But this issue of what's in it for me, why do I need to do it? What's the value? How will it help me? Perhaps is an important thing. Lots of questions about particular groups. Who are the least engaged? EL students came up on one of the comments as well. I'll do the same thing as last time, because all of our panelists have been following the chat, and go around the group and ask for any observations and comments. And over to you first, Tim.
I need to apologise. There's a standing joke in our leadership team that whenever we have a call, one of my children is playing some kind of brass instrument. So if you can hear James Bond in the background, that's pre-lesson. It's that worry about getting kids straight back in and getting them into a test is our worry as well, and we won't be doing that. The point I made earlier on today is that we'll have 3 weeks, whether that's 3 weeks or 6 weeks, depending on the nature of kids coming back in, where we'll spend our time using classroom-based formative assessment strategies to work out where the gaps are, rather than, sorry, GL colleagues, getting them straight back in and using our GL tests, because actually we will be uncomfortable with that. We'll have to do something like that with our New Year 7s, and that's what we'll be doing every year. So it'll be a part of our understanding of progress armory that we'll miss for a year, but actually what David said earlier in talking about teacher judgments, actually our teachers got a lot better at judging whether or not children are in the right place. So I think we'll probably rely more on that in their formative approaches.
Just one other thing, Tim. Where are you on this notion? I was an Australian academic, Hedley Bow, who used this phrase about the tyranny of the omni-capable teacher. We expect teachers all to do the same things in the same way, and we bung them in a classroom 5 hours a day. I love one of the comments that said, it was great, I think it was Andy who said, we don't expect teachers to be the same. There's lots of different ways of being good. But do we help teachers by not recognising, especially in this new world, where some people will be better at different things and play more to their strengths?
Yes, and I think, people as participants will have different perceptions on this in terms of the progress of their schools. We were very quick as a school to move away as far as possible from any form of lesson judgment, a fixed lesson observation form that said, thou shalt teach this way, which for those of us like me who are kind of tail end of the Blair era teachers who were trained in a certain way, has been liberating, really, and expecting good quality education is when learning happens, isn't it? And when teachers understand the learning gaps and have the strategies for how they're going to fill them. And the same is true about now, I think. It's been amazing seeing. I'm a linguist, so I do some Key Stage 3 language teaching still, but I'm effectively sharing the lessons that colleagues of mine have come up with, which are utterly brilliant. And I look at them and think, what wonderful creative opportunity this is for not just 25-year-old newbies, but also the head of MFL who's retiring at the end of the year, who's still producing and coming up with a different approach, doing the same thing. I think it's...
Thank Tim for that. And by the way, one of the chats you may have noticed said that it was very eerie having nothing happening, just the background slide in your break. So if your son wants to come into the room off screen and play during the break, I think it would enhance the session.
It would be lovely, but I have to leave you to irritate my leadership team colleagues by Josie, my daughter actually. That's gender stereotyping of boys playing brass instruments, that, David.
well, I don't otherwise, Alex, to have music in the break. Hilary, could I bring you in on one of the other questions on the chat about whether it's particular groups who have been less engaged? Do we have any knowledge about that?
So I haven't seen anything to date in the UK, but I know that across in the States, they've managed to, in certain districts where they've solved the digital divide by supplying free Wi-Fi and devices to the whole district, they have had experiences where they've started to see patterns around, perhaps it's not the digital divide, but it's actually the environment the child's in, whether that's conducive to learning, whether they have a space in the home they can do that in, that actually their propensity to complete tasks is lower than some of their other children. We kind of suspect that in the UK, but we don't yet have any evidence of it during this time. But certainly I think that when you speak to teachers, as we have done, speak to some of our partner schools, they will talk about the fact that even if they have a learning platform and they've got a class of, say, 30 kids, some kids are far more active, and when they phone the kids up, they're not being encouraged to necessarily be on the platform, or they're just not engaging with that form of learning at the moment. So I think there are probably certain groups that it will come out have not engaged as much as others. I think what we don't know is whether engagement has actually led to a good experience. So you might have children who are engaging every day, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're progressing.
This is the hidden gaps, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think, I mean, teachers got very good at differentiating. I think this is this worry, and I know it's the worry of the Children's Commissioner and others, that one of the reasons they've been the pressure to get kids back to school is they think the gaps will widen. But I mean, it's going to be really interesting when we look at the knowledge. And I get interested within groups as well, and why have some within particular sections of groups. And again, I think some of these forms of standardized testing and things can help at an individual level, not to just see kids within a particular sector or group. Should we say any more response? Andy, anything you'd like to pick up from on the chat?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question about the testing when we come back is really interesting. I would agree with Tim and some of the other comments that we need to be very cautious about when we do that. But I think equally we mustn't lose sight of the fact that on the whole, the kids are probably more resilient than we are. And we've got to be very cautious not to project our anxieties onto them when they do come back in. And that's something that I do worry about, is that our students will come back pretty full of beans and full of life, and it'll be our anxieties about the situation and how that actually then they take on. So it's an interesting one about supporting colleagues with that. I think the other thing was that kind of does worry me at the moment as well is around that sense of deployment of staff. So how can we make sure that they are supported to, as you say, we have this opportunity. Tim talked about his three, I can't remember the term used, but the three types of school.
Andy?
Yeah. So how can we support staff to focus on the areas at which perhaps they can contribute most effectively? But actually that's where we operate quite a lot of distributed leadership, so that it's kind of relying on all of the heads of departments in all the schools to make that happen, and to ensure that we haven't got lots of people reinventing the wheel and feeling really intimidated by what others are doing. Like Tim, I'm not a linguist, but I've seen what our language department doing. They've got some virtual classroom thing set up, is amazing. But I imagine for others who are maybe just dipping their toe into the water with narrated PowerPoint, it can be quite intimidating. So I think it's about supporting those kind of expectations as well.
It's a leadership challenge, isn't it, Andy, to balance it in terms of entitlement for students and at the same time empower staff, because I think there's probably as much work to do, and lots of staff are in different positions in their heads over this, and it will mirror the wider society as well. But the support of staff, empowering them and helping them to do what they do well almost, is quite an important part of this. There's one other question just emerged on the chat. I think it was from John, talking about the crucial leadership. If any colleagues have a chance just to look at it and respond to that, because it's quite an interesting question on the why of testing as well. Does anybody like to respond to that, just to finish this?
I think it's I mean, if all of these points that people are making, which are coming from people who are informed as to what data works and doesn't work, shows us what we can and can't trust, and actually knowing all the limitations of what we're looking at going into it makes that data, to me, more worthwhile, I think, in recognising, okay, I can't use this for a judgment, I am using this for different reasons, I recognise this is limited. I think that helps. The more informed we are about where we can't use this information or where it fails, the more important it is. That's a rubbish answer.
Thanks for that, Tim. I mean, to me, there's two things. One is that we shouldn't over credit the use of some of the data. So using it as a hypothesis to test, using it to aid judgment and combine with other judgments, to me, are very powerful. And the other message I think both of you model is that you don't overcomplicate and overload on data, because the power is lost. And I think with individual staff, that's an interesting territory, which I know a number have been working on for some years, because the days when the data person, the school staff, used to give people a rather large pile of data and say, here it all is hopefully one that's gone, but it's an easy trap to fall into. Well,
David, sorry, can I just come in on that? Because I think it's really important as well, is that you're no longer alone with that data. I think that both Darren and Dan have pointed out that how there's lots of curriculum maps, curriculum ideas, intervention ideas. There's lots of additional data that you get on the individual and on groups, and there's lots of support that comes from GL as well. And I just also wanted to pick up, I know Dan was going to come in as well, in that I know that you're working, Dan, I'm right in saying, on a timeline and making sure that the testing is at the right time for your context, and that you wouldn't imagine young people coming and sitting for a week doing tests. So I think, Dan, it might be good to
Dan, do you want to do that to close the session? Dan?
Definitely. I think we've been monitoring feedback, talking to lots of schools, and I totally concur with the, not wanting to bombard and assess at the beginning. So we are looking at sort of how we can support timeframes. We've had schools even looking all the way back through to January before they want to do formal assessment. I think we're just putting in sort of personalised timelines. If you wanted to use different assessments, how you could use them, what the data is telling you at that point, and actually how it can help triangulate the picture that you're building. And actually we've got an assessment insights team that are literally working one-on-one with schools to kind of help support them in that time frame and timeline. Every school will be different in what that looks like for them and what return to school looks like. And we want to just make sure that actually we supported you in that, and actually the assessments are when you need the data, when it's going to help make an impact for you. Certainly not just pushing assessment on everyone in September. We totally concur. The pastoral part.
Is it a problem if everybody doesn't do it at the same time, and some do it online, some do it in a written form? What's your take on that for this purpose?
Absolutely. I think the key thing is, with our assessments, they're standardized over a period of time. And I think right across this autumn term, this is why we're looking to do this extra analysis, especially around the progress test, to really kind of look at what that trend analysis is showing us at this time. It is quite unique what people's starting points, what baselines look like. So I think we need to do some more analysis on that to help share with schools what that looks like, and perhaps what new normal, what trends we're seeing from the data at this stage.
Okay, thank you all. And this is the point where we're halfway through. This team of panelists, though we have Darren and Dan back with us and Hilary, thank you particularly to Tim and Andy for their insightful and reflective comments, and from people who grapple on the ground in making things happen. Often it's not necessarily perfection. We haven't got all the answers, but I have great regard and admiration for what both of those people do. And thank you both for your contributions today, and thank you all to all those who've contributed to the chat in the last hour. And I hope we've been answering things, but if you feel you haven't, keep putting comments on it and we'll come back to it later on. We're going to break for 15 minutes again. I don't know if it's live Zumba sessions outside, a bit of activity maybe, and look forward to hearing what you've been doing. And join us again in 15 minutes time, when we'll be looking at the reading gap and words and access, and some fantastic work that's been done in often quite challenging circumstances. So join us again in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.